Today we're going to continue our Book of Mark journey. But I think I still, once in a while, get lost in the weeds or get stuck in the sand somewhere, and I have to dig there for a while to but it's good. Sometimes it's good to get stuck somewhere and just enjoy the spot, right? I feel like, man, I want to get to a certain spot and Mark, but I'm like, man, I need to cover this. I need to explore this part of Mark a little bit. But I was really inspired by this story, by this guy who went to the doctor. He says, a man visited his doctor, and the doctor checked him. And then he commented, and he said, it looks like you have a fair bit of exercise. And the man replied, oh yeah, in fact, just the other day I walked 5 miles over rugged terrain as I climbed over rocks and trees. I also waded along the edges of a lake, pushing my way through all tall thistles, and even slid down sandy slopes while getting sand in my eyes. And the doctor was quite impressed. Well, you're certainly a dedicated outdoor enthusiast. He says, man replied, not really, doctor. I'm just a really bad golfer. That's why Peter's so fit. When he goes golfing, he has to go climb the ditches and the gullies and the sand pits. I'm right there with you. That's good news. Hey, you get something good out of it, right? I'm just there to hunt golf balls. I just collect them. I don't care whatever. My goal is always to go home with more than what I came there for. Even though I lose a bunch, but I find more, right? So, anyway, today, sorry I don't have slides for you, but I like to change it up once in a while. Make you guys guessing. Who brought a Bible? Anybody brought a Bible? Do you even have a Bible? Are you guys? Look, we got one faithful man there. I don't know what you guys are watching on there. You're probably watching TikTok and Snapchat. I don't know. You got the games going on there, but they should at least have their phones in the with the shape of a Bible, right? So you can. They probably would do it. Cut out the hole inside the Bible so it looks like the other Bible, but there's a phone in there. Yeah. But yeah, if you want, follow along. We're going to go in Mark chapter 9 and in Mark chapter 10. But Peter covered some of it the one time when he preached on about the part where he says, it's better for you to cut off your arm and to plug out your eye instead of going to heaven or going to hell in a full body, right? Instead of going to heaven, cut your arm off. Yeah, I almost got that wrong. But I want to cover, there's something that caught my attention is in the part in chapter 9, right after they come down the mountain of Transfiguration. He went with the 3 disciples that were with him, right? And then it says they went down. So we're going to read in, starting on verse 11. Oh no, not verse 11. So then he asked them about the question about Elijah, and he gives them that answer. But in verse 14, he says, when they came down the mountain to the other 9 disciples, they noticed a large crowd of people gathered around them, with the religious scholars arguing with them. The crowd was astonished to see Jesus himself walking toward them. So they immediately ran to welcome him. And he says, what are you arguing about with the religious scholars? He asked them. Very important thing to remember there, okay? A man spoke up out of the crowd. Teacher, he said, I have a son possessed by a demon that makes him mute. I brought him here to you, Jesus. Whenever the demon takes control of him, it knocks him down, and he foams at the mouth and gnashes his teeth, and his body becomes stiff as a board. I brought him to your disciples, hoping they could deliver him, but they were not able to do it. Jesus said to the crowd, why are you such faithless people? How much longer must I remain with you and put up with your unbelief? Now bring the boy to me. So they brought him to Jesus, and as soon as the demon saw him, it threw the boy into convulsions. He fell to the ground, rolling around and foaming at the mouth. Jesus turned to the father and asked him, how long has your son been tormented like this? Since childhood, he replied. It tries over and over to kill him by throwing him into the fire or into the water. But please, if you're able to do something, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said, What do you mean if? All right, remember that. If you are able to believe, all things are possible to the believer. When they heard this, the boy's father cried out with tears, saying, I do believe, Lord, help my little faith. Now when Jesus saw that the crowd was quickly growing larger, he commanded the demon, saying, Deaf and mute spirit, I command you to come out of him and never enter him again. The demon shrieked and threw the boy into the terrible seizures and finally came out of him. As the boy lay there, looking like a corpse, everyone thought he was dead. But Jesus stooped down, gently took his hand and raised him up to his feet, and he stood there completely set free. And then afterwards, when Jesus arrived at the house, his disciples asked him in private, Why couldn't we cast out that demon? He answered them, This type of powerful spirit can only be cast out by fasting and prayer. Well, so this text here has brought many people to believe, well, I must be doing a lot of things wrong, right? It's very self-centered, very self-image, right? Like you're turning around and are looking at yourself, because the way Jesus talks here, it almost sounds that way, right? But we want to cover some interesting things here. So we're going to go to Matthew chapter 17, and here is the exact same story, Matthew 17. How fast are you guys on your phones to get there? Waiting. Is it loading? Yeah. Anyway, so Matthew chapter 17, verse 14 on, it has the same story, right? And then, but there's just a few minor details that are a bit different, all right? But we need to kind of look at both of them. And then they come down the mountain. There's a large crowd, but it's no mention of Jesus asking, what are you arguing about? All right, so an important detail to remember, because a lot of people, they have the story of this part where they don't have the part where Jesus says something first before anybody comes to him. But anyway, the man starts off with the man first coming to him right away and says, I have a son who has epilepsy, and all these things are happening to him, and he falls down. And he's being tortured, right? Tormented. Jesus replied, Where is your faith? Can't you see how wayward and wrong this generation? How much longer do I stay with you and put up with your doubts? Bring your son to me. And that sounds very harsh, don't you think? The way Jesus is like, man, how long am I? Like, you guys get it together, right? So how many have had the question, what does it mean to have little faith? Let's address that question right off the hop, right? You have little faith. Many times Jesus addressed that. When they were on the boat and then they thought they were going to die, they were going to drown, the disciples are like, Jesus, do you not care? And he says, you have little faith, or you're faithless. Or like that term, there's different terms and different wording used in the English translations, but there's one word that word means. So if you look up the word little faith, all right, I'm going to read the definition of it. So a lot of people they get so confused right away with the word faith, like there's an amount, okay? You need to now get rid of the idea that faith is a measure, all right? Okay, get rid of it. So why does it say little faith, right? Well, you have to look in the context, right? He says, the fact that he says, how long must I be with you? You have to connect the dots here. So he says, you have little faith. How long must I be with you? Okay, you have to kind of understand what he's trying to get at. So because remember the book of Revelation, what were a similar phrase on every church letter that he wrote to all the 7 churches? What is a very similar, how he ended all the letters? If you have ears to hear, hear. If you have eyes to see, see, right? All right. That context. All right, so the word little faith means oligopistos, describes someone dull to hearing the Lord's voice or disinterested in walking intimately with him. In contrast, the goal of life is to receive the Lord's gift of faith in the scene of life. So it's the same context as in John chapter 10, where he says, my sheep hear my voice. My sheep hear, and then he says, when the shepherd is like, you don't have to be afraid, because my sheep, when they hear my voice, they come, right? So the word little faith is not that, oh man, I'm short on faith. What do I have to do? No, it's someone that is not listening. So you have to just think, well, where does faith come from? Hearing the word of God. And that's why he says, how long must I be with you? Right? Because he says, you guys are not listening to me. Pay attention. They were not hearing. Right? So now you have to go back to Mark. Remember what he said. What did the man ask Jesus? What did Jesus answer the man at first? He says, if you can, please have compassion on me. And then he says, what do you mean if? The fact that he asked him, what do you mean if, means the man has not been listening. It was not on Jesus, and it was not on like that. So there's a connection to it. So it's not that you're have to go find faith and come back to Jesus and says, Jesus, I filled up my bucket of faith. Am I good now? No, you actually, to get faith, you go to Jesus. All right? But we're going to talk more about that and I thought about it even during worship. So worship, did you know that worship is actually a form of prayer? Actually is prayer. And we're going to talk about prayer a little bit more later, but this is all kind of connected. I'm going to see if I can tie it all together so you guys can stay in the boat with me, all right? And not jump ship and drown and miss out on what I'm trying to say. So I came across an article by Charles Spurgeon, and I was like, man, people need to actually study what he believed, because a lot of people are like, oh, Spurgeon, yeah, great, but man, you don't actually have no idea what he actually said. There's some powerful things that man understood that the church today has no grasp of. Like, it's just amazing. But he had this, he was talking about faith in the context of faith, and he says, certainly love cannot flourish except as faith flourishes. If you doubt your Lord, you will think hard thoughts of him and cease to love him as you should. If you fall in trouble and you doubt his wisdom or his goodness in sending it, the next thing you will be that your heart will be cold towards him. You will begin to think your Lord to be tyrannical and harsh to you, and you will quarrel with him. So he was really addressing, you need to have the right image of who he is, because if you don't trust him, then when something happens, you will blame him. Right? All right, let's go further into the story. It was because of your lack of faith in Matthew that he says. But then you go down further. And then it says, verse 20. Let's read. I'm going to start verse 20 to 21 in Matthew, right? I'm just going to try to get the context right. And he says, he told them, it was because of your lack of faith, I promise you, if you have faith inside of you, no bigger than the size of a small mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move away from here and go over there, and you will see it move. There is nothing you couldn't do. Right? So he's like, if you would just get faith, if you guys would just pay attention, then he says, there's nothing you couldn't do, right? So he's like giving them a promise, like he's offering them faith. He says, if you guys come. So, but we're going to go, I'm going to try to not get ahead of myself here, but there's something in the next chapter that really ties it together. So then he ends up, but this kind is cast out only through prayer and fasting, right? So a lot of people are like, okay, I need to pray harder and I need to fast, then I will have power to drive out the demon, right? All right, now I want to give you a definition of the word does not come out, or like cast out, but this kind is not cast out. This kind is not cast out. So he's not, you have to look at the context of what he's talking about. What is the context? Right before he said that, this thing is not cast out unless with prayer and fasting. The verse right before he says, if you have this faith like the size of a mustard seed, there's nothing you couldn't do. And this, he's still talking about the same topic. He's not changing topics. He's still talking about faith. He's not talking to the demon now. He's not talking about the demon. He's addressing the context of faith. And he says, this does not come forth unless by prayer and fasting. He says, casting out, it means to bring forth. So the word there, it means to go out, to go forth, or to go forth. If you want faith to go forth, to flow out of you, he says it's not done by prayer and fasting. So now we need to because we have so many messed up definitions of all these words that makes it so hard on people. So now, what's the word prayer? Anybody have, you want to give it a shot? What's your definition of prayer? I think the reason most people don't know the definition of prayer, that's why they hesitate to pray. They don't know how to pray. They don't know, what's the point of prayer? Actually, very good. Star for you. Yeah. I think St. Peter is going to be a little bit easier on you at the gates. One more diamond on your crown. Relationship. Actually, prayer and communion go hand in hand. What's communion? Common union. Communion means you're communicating. Those words are all connected. All right, so the word, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but the word prayer actually means to towards or exchange or to wish, pray, properly to exchange wishes. Pray, literally to interact with the Lord by switching human wishes, ideas for his wishes, which then he imparts faith. The word prayer is you talk to God, this is my wish, and then God's like, this is also my wish, and then he imparts the faith. That's why he says, that's why it's important. You communicate with your God, that's where faith comes from. That's why the importance of prayer. You speak to him, you talk to him, you communicate, you interact. Wow, now I'm going to start. Going back and forth, right? Or sometimes prayer is, God, this is what's happening to me. What is your wish on this situation? And he's more than willing to answer it. Just like the man said, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. This is my wish. What is your wish? And then Jesus says, I have compassion. I would love to. In every instance, it says that he had compassion on them, and then he acted, right? At one instance, he says, if you will, Lord, you will heal me. And then he says, I want to. What do you mean if I could? He says, I want to. That's the interaction. Sometimes to get things, to receive something, we don't have to have theology figured out. And that's something I want to talk about today more, is the whole aspect of trust. And we're going to see it in the next chapter about how he receives the children. And he says, in order to enter the kingdom of God, you have to become like one of these. All right? Why is he specifically looking to the kids? And it actually says these were children that were carried to him. They were small. They didn't come with buckets of faith the way we think. But what was it about a child that he thought was so many? He says, in order for you to receive or to experience the kingdom, you need to become like one of these. And it's actually very simple. Trust. A child is trusting. And he says that's the problem with him. And he says that's why he addresses, and right in the beginning, when he comes down the mountain, what are you arguing about? Why do people argue? Because they don't trust. People are arguing with God all day long because they don't trust him. Jesus is actually saying, I don't want your theology to be all in line, but I want you to trust me. And that's what Charles Spurgeon, in the article that I came across by him, and he says, he addresses that faith produces love. He says faith and love, he's referencing the Galatians 5 verse 6, that faith works by love, and he says faith and love, you can't separate them. But he says every time there's a relationship, you first trust the person, and then love comes. He says you can't love someone unless you trust them. But he says so there has to be trust. When you develop a relationship, you trust them. Mr. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem said this: there is one kind of faith, the dogmatic, involving an assent of the soul on some particular point, but there is a second kind of faith which is bestowed by Christ as a gift of grace. The faith, then, which is given of grace from the Spirit is not merely doctrinal, but also works things above man's power. Sometimes faith is not about like what's the what do you have the doctrine all figured out and put together? Maximus the Confessor said, "As the memory of fire does not warm the body, so faith without love does not bring about the illumination of knowledge in the soul." That's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, you can do all these things and you have not love, it's nothing. But he says, if. But he actually is not admitting that you can, but he says, if. Because love and faith are always connected. So then there's the question about what's the difference between belief and faith. The faith is a gift, right? But then he says, Lord, help my unbelief, or like I believe. So the word believe is to think to be true, to be persuaded of, to credit, or to place confidence in. He says, Lord, I believe, like I trust you, but help my unbelief. I'm going to trust you, but help my, talk to me again, because I wasn't listening before. Like he admitted, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I want to hear. And then Jesus spoke, and faith came because he heard the word, right? This fly is going to die. It will at some point. I'm glad they have short lives. Only 2 days? It feels like a lot longer sometimes when they're around. So now I want to go to Mark chapter 10. I know there's a bunch of other stories that happen in between, but there's this little instance right there in verse 13. He says, parents kept bringing their little children to Jesus so that he would lay his hands on them and bless them. But the disciples kept rebuking and scolding the people for doing it. When Jesus saw what was happening, he became indignant with his disciples and said to them, let all the little children come to me and never hinder them. Don't you know that God's kingdom exists for such as these? Listen to the truth I speak. Whoever does not open their arms to receive God's kingdom like a teachable child will never enter it. He's talking about people, because how did Jesus address a lot of these Pharisees? They came with argumentative mentality. They didn't come with a teachable mindset. They didn't come with a listening mindset. They came with I'm going to prove you wrong kind of mindset, right? And you know what? I thought about it the other day, and I was I was trying to put all these stories together. I was talking to multiple different people, and I asked them, what was it that brought you to realize, to experience the goodness of God? What was it? What was the connection between all these stories? And it was all of them. They were done with arguing. They were ready to listen. They were ready to receive. They were ready to communicate. They were ready to talk to be real with God. God, come on, tell me something. I'm done with what I'm trying to hold on to. This is not, I'm ready to hear. I'm missing something, right? Paul Ellis says this in connection to Galatians 5:6, because in Galatians 5 or 6 it says, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision or uncircumcision. He says, so sometimes we're harping on the ones that are trying to follow the law, but he also harped on the ones that did not want to follow the law. He says it's circumcision nor uncircumcision that makes you right with God. He says the people that are trying to find righteousness by any of those means, by not circumcising, some are trying to be righteous by not doing something, and some are trying to be righteous by doing something. He says neither of those. It's not doesn't mean anything. He says but faith working through love. That's why. So when the way Charles Spurgeon put it, he says first there's trust. If you he was addressing the idea that how people if they want, everybody wants to love God, right? They want to love God. They really want to love God. They love God. But he says trust is what starts first, faith, and then love comes, just like in a relationship. But he says, then he goes all the way, reverts back to, says, he first loved us, that's why we can love him. All right? He says this, faith is light while love is heat. In every beam of grace from the Sun of righteousness you will find a measure of each. True faith in God cannot exist without love to him, nor sincere love without faith. They are united like the Siamese twins, and where you meet the one, the other sure is to be present. So if we want to address the issue of if you're thinking, man, I don't have love, well then you need to meet someone. You meet his love. You need to have an encounter with his love. And he goes on to say, love, moreover, forbids unbelief and so helps faith, for love says, how can we grieve him by doubts? Does not true love in every heart, when exercised towards a man or a woman, forbid distrust? Fear in the form of distrust hath torment, and therefore love casts it out. The want, or which means the lack of mutual confidence in married life, is the death of love. But love is instinctively tender of showing anything that suspicion towards a dear and faithful lover. Even when it supposes that there is an error, love puts it down as by no means a willful fault, but concludes that there may be a sense in which it is right. For love believeth all things, endureth all things, and will not tolerate mistrust, which it knows to be warm at the very core of the heart. So you see, where there is great love of Christ, it forbids doubt, and thus kills the foxes of distrust, which spoil the tender vines of faith. Where there is love, it destroys distrust. The fact that God gave his unconditional love, died, he says, I gave everything. How much more will not give you everything? So every person that Jesus encountered, his mission was that they would have a revelation of his love, right? But he said, you need to trust me. Some they just didn't trust him. It doesn't matter what they said, but that's why he came to the disciples and says, the kingdom of God is for such like these little ones, the ones that trust. He says they will enter. It starts with trust. You have to at some point trust. You can gather a lot of information. You can gather everything. At some point there has to be trust. Because if you have it all figured out, that doesn't then there's not really trust, is there? When you I did a wedding yesterday, and then when you watch these people get married, they actually are really trusting one another because they have only a limited amount of information about each other, right? About their knowledge of one another, right? We fall short. God knows. That's why he says, I look forward to knowing him like we are known. God fully knows us. But he says, I look forward to know him like he knows us. Love to Jesus feels that we were better to distrust all men and angels than doubt. So if you want to trust him, he concludes that loving Jesus is this. You need to distrust men and angels, then doubt the dear Redeemer who poured out his blood to prove his love. Distrust the heavens, for they shall pass away. Distrust the earth, for it shall be utterly burnt up. Distrust man, for he is as broken reed. But never distrust the faithful God. Lean on him with your whole weight. Repose in him with your undivided confidence. So love teaches and faith learns her lesson. Love teaches and faith comes to life. So the answer when Jesus shows up, it's okay to have that. That's why prayer and okay, now let's address the word fasting. A lot of people are like, well, so me not eating food helps me to gain more faith. Pray and not eating food, being miserable all day because I'm hungry, is going to give me more faith. I've been thinking about it so much. The whole idea of not eating food is just that does any benefit, that it exchanges any spiritual gain. Little demons flying around. I showered. I think I did. So fast, because it's not even referring to he's not specifically fasting from food. By prayer and fast. So when you're communicating, so if you want to use, because a lot of manuscripts didn't have the word fasting in there, or even that verse, the whole prayer and fasting, but some of them did, some of the newer ones. But if you want to put fasting, if you want to fast, so fast or refrain from what you think is true, what you see with your eyes. I fast from what I'm seeing in front of me, and I will believe what God says about this situation, right? So if you really want to fast, refrain from that. Refrain from believing what's in front of your eyes, which is the demon showing their power, right? And trusting that God actually loves to redeem. They were hit, like he was not confident that Jesus wanted to redeem his child. And then and that actually answers the question why the disciples could not do it, because they were arguing with the religious leaders. So what do you think they were arguing about? So this kid is there, demon possessed, and these things are happening, right? Yet they're here debating of what should be done, right? Like, what do you think they were debating? Or what were they arguing about? Because they obviously were fighting about something, right? Maybe there is like arguing about, well, is it the will of God that this should happen? Is it God's will that this, no, that's just, them, or maybe they were debating, the father must have sinned, the child there's sin in their life. It's a lot of those arguments happening today, and yet there's people that are suffering right beside you while everybody is like, no. I was like, man, let's just bypass all that and actually serve and help people, right? Like, that's where I realized, like, I'm done. Like, it's not my calling to argue. Like, Jesus bypassed the Pharisees. Notice how he didn't go to the Pharisees and try to convince them. He went right to the one that he had compassion on, that was suffering. And he went to convince them. He says, I know you're here. It's the same with when Jesus is on the way to heal the daughter of the, what was his name? Now I forget, sorry. But then the woman with the issue of blood touched him and then was interrupted by that. But on the way, the servants came and said, don't bother the Messiah or the teacher, because your child is passed away, right? And then he says, he doesn't try to convince them. He goes right to the one that came initially and says, listen here, keep believing what you said before. Keep listening to me, right? He's not trying to put the pressure on him. He says, but keep listening to me. I'm talking to you. I'm offering you something. I'll bring you the faith, right? I'm going to finish off by 1 John 4, verse 16. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in his love abides in God, and God abides in him. We have come to know his love. Notice how he says, so we have come to know and to believe the love. They were like, I trust that he loves. Like, they came to it. And how was it? Because God is love. Like, they just experienced love for him. And we've come to know his love. And he says, we love him because he goes on to say, we love him because he first loved us. So, and then if you connect it with Galatians 5:6, faith works by love. Amen. That's all I got to say today. Does anybody else have a word you want to share in connection to that? Anybody ever been to a point where, man, I don't quite understand what's going on. I don't quite understand, but I'm just like, hey, I'm throwing up my head, my hand, like a little child, and I just trust you. I trust what you said. I just remember so clearly the one time when the whole idea of finances, and then I was reading, and I was like, okay, God, I'm done trying to figure this out. So I read it, where it says, if the birds in the air are taken care of, and the flowers in the field are taken care of, how much more would you not be taken care of? And I was like, God, okay, I'm jumping on your lap, and I'm trusting I'll be okay. And it was so liberating to let go that way. Like, it was just, trust is an amazing thing. But you have to ignore all the voices that say, no, but. Turn away from all the big buts, right? They're always in the way. And look unto him who is the author and finisher of our faith, right? He's the one that created the faith, and he's also the finisher of it. He also produces what faith produces. So, thank you, Jesus.